the amusingly named writer-director Randolph Colon brings us one of the most cheesy films from the 80s. We are talking Night Shadow, also known as Lycanthrope, and this is a 1989 low-budget werewolf movie that stars Brenda Vance as our main character Alex, an intrepid reporter that gets mixed up when she visits her hometown in a werewolf in the form of this kind of drifter who happens upon this small American town and unleashes his lycanthrope curse upon its inhabitants. What'll happen? You'll have to watch the movie and find out. So, this is a film that I actually owned on VHS a long time ago. And even back then, I remember seeing the cover art, the VHS cover art on the shelf and thinking, that doesn't look very good. It had a kind of photograph of the werewolf on it. And I thought, this werewolf looks like it's made out of fuzzy felt. So eventually I kind of bought it because I did sort of collect most kind of horror films back then, and yeah, it was kind of cheap. Anyway, let's talk about what works though before we get into what doesn't work. Okay, here's what I will say about this movie. This movie is somewhat of an ensemble piece, despite the character of Alex being our main character. You know, there's quite a lot of screen time given to other inhabitants of this kind of small town. And I have to say, for the most part, I found all of these kind of like residents quite charming in a kind of small town kind of way. I mean, even the kind of the douchey kind of guy still kind of like quite funny and quite kind of charming in a weird way. I like the kind of the relationships between the kind of different characters. Although everyone here seemed kind of just quite, you know, very kind of 80s apple pie, if that kind of makes sense. So they're kind of like, you kind of somewhat care about the kind of the characters. The plot will kind of remind you of like a werewolf spin on Jaws. This small American town, this killing star, and all the inhabitants kind of want answers, and it's up to the kind of the town sheriff, and he's getting pressured by the mayor to kind of find out what's going on, except it's not a shark this time, it's a kind of a werewolf. There is some actually quite effective shots, not of the werewolf exactly, but the werewolf in its human form, with this guy who looks like the most suspicious guy you will ever see. We'll come on to that again. But when our main character Alex kind of happens to kind of like pass him a couple of times, and they have somewhat of a kind of a stare off, and there's like sound effects of lightning and kind of overlays of kind of like storm clouds over the kind of the screen and spooky music. I have to say it looked pretty good, and there's kind of the guy who plays this werewolf. Yeah, he looks pretty menacing in a kind of Jess Franco kind of way. Yeah, it's kind of like there were quite kind of fun sequences. The werewolf itself doesn't really show up until, you know, a good portion into the last act of the movie. But actually reminds me a little bit of the werewolves from the TV show, simply called Werewolf. Although I have to say, I think those costumes were still better than this one. I mean, it's a low-budget kind of sort of movie. I guess, you know, there was only so much you can do, and it is a full kind of body snouted bipedal werewolf. But it looks, not the best. Let's just be honest. But there's a reasonable kind of semi-transformation scene, which I thought was quite good. You kind of see part of the way through the transformation. And there's one thing you will enjoy this movie. If you're a fan of the 80s, oh boy. I mean, this is a 1989 movie. That's when it came out, at least. But it feels like it was made earlier than that. To me, this feels like it's more of like it was made sort of 1984, I would say. There is some 80s fashion. We have one of the best mullets you've ever seen on screen, and some really, well, quite amusing 80s fashion. Let me just kind of say that. So if you want to go back and laugh at the 80s, check this one out. It's hard pressed to find a more kind of fashion-conscious 80s movie than this one, I would wager. There's actually a couple of okay martial arts scenes in there, for no real reason, but I guess the actor could do it, so they shoehorned a few martial arts scenes in. but they're of reasonable quality and well choreographed. And there you go. So let's talk about what doesn't work, and let's talk about those martial arts, because this guy is our main character's brother, who does all these kind of martial arts, and we see him like do all these kind of martial arts at the with these kind of biker gangs and things like that. And you think, okay, they're setting him up to be a great fighter. So are we going to have like a kung fu versus werewolf showdown at the end of the movie? Because ultimately he's kind of the one that is one of the people that are there at the end of the showdown. No, that doesn't happen. There's no like showdown really between this character and the werewolf. There is, but not involving any kind of hand-to-hand combat. Why introduce it? Why set that up? And I can only assume that the actor, knew martial arts, and it just was worked into the script, but it didn't have any bearing on the plot. But let's continue talking about the characters. Let's talk about our main character, played by Brenda Vance, of Alex, this kind of intrepid reporter. Absolutely has no impact on the story whatsoever. You could take her out of the plot and it would be exactly the same. She has zero impact on anything that happens in the movie. It's like, I mean, I guess she's related to the brother, who has a minor impact, I suppose, or some degree of impact, and she's kind of flirting with the police chief, who has a kind of a bit of an impact, but herself directly, nothing. No impact on this kind of, on the story itself. What a kind of passive central character. Weird. So yeah, there you kind of your main characters there. It's her, Alex, her brother. You know, he does a couple of cool fight scenes, but ultimately doesn't really pay off into anything story-wise. The police are beyond crappy in this movie, with a kind of like realistic kind of procedure. It's an 80s TV movie. I know we're not expecting much here, but yeah, they're pretty rubbish. I mean, like, this is a kind of a cheesy 80s B movie, but honestly, some of the kind of the decision making in this movie, I grant you, yes, storytelling may not have been quite as sophisticated back then for the majority of films. Expectations may have been lower, but I mean, I mentioned this character of Alex doesn't have, any impact on the story. In actual fact, thinking about it, she's almost somewhat detrimental, because there's a couple of murders that happen, and the first victim is a guy that she says she passed on the road, and she drives past a guy who is a werewolf. It's established straight off the bat, and the police tells the press, there was bodies were found in a abandoned car that she drove past and sees this guy, and she doesn't think to mention anything. We have the brother and his friends kind of happen to kind of like go into this guy's hotel room, and they find a drawer full of meat. After they've already been told there's a murderer around, a drawer full of meat and some kind of like other kind of weird paraphernalia. Again, don't say anything to the police, until kind of much later in the film. It's just silly. There's just so many silly things in this movie. As I mentioned, we don't really see the werewolf until the last act of the movie, and we don't really see him in his full glory, I would say, until the last kind of 10 minutes. When we do see the werewolf, as I've mentioned, it's unfortunately not the best suit, and it really looks just like it's made out of carpet or fuzzy felt, as I've mentioned. The costume isn't brilliant. Maybe that's why they didn't show it very much. I appreciated the attempt here to have this kind of like full body suit and stuff, but it's not the best. It looks actually better on moving than it does in still frames, admittedly, but it's pretty weak. The story mostly focuses on the kind of the townsfolk as they are kind of scrabbling around, and as I say, this werewolf, we know next to nothing about him, but but he seems to be just as kind of psychopathic in his human form. Clearly knows he's a werewolf. He's carrying bodies around in his car and things like that. Sounds like it would be an interesting character to explore. What kind of... I mean, get like a little bit... He's maybe looking for a bride, but it's like just reading his passage in his journal or something, and that's all we get. You know, it's kind of like, it would have been interesting to kind of find out a little bit more. You know, there's so many unresolved plot lines. We see him like pick up our reporter's ID, and you think he's going to be stalking her, and he seems to be sitting across the table from her at one point, but nothing is done. So that doesn't pay off at all. I mean, there's a lot of setup and no payoff in this movie. I mean, the acting's typically kind of like 80s, but I think the acting was cheesy and fun in a weird way, but it's not the best. So yeah, it's kind of a bit of a silly movie in many ways. I mean, it has its kind of, as I said, it has some fun, I guess you want to say. It's kind of a fun, very cheesy movie. A couple of okay fight scenes, but they have no real bearing on the story. And I quite like the weird sort of like music video effects of our werewolf in human form looking massively suspicious, standing there with ripped clothes and kind of like, you know, looking suspiciously at people. Oh, it's a stranger in town. There's been a few murders. We've got this guy who's like acting super suspicious, but no one will kind of go, that guy was looking a bit weird. Anyway, I have to say this was a 3 out of 10. I can't honestly give it more than that. It's not a good film. It's not a good film. But it's kind of a little fun time capsule in a weird way. If you like some cheesiness, but I've never thought this movie was particularly good, even back when I saw it on VHS. I'm watching it now. Yeah, it's not essential viewing. Let me just put it that 3 out of 10. Have you seen it? What did you think of it? Leave me a comment, and I'll look forward to seeing you next time.